Good morning, early risers. How appropriate that we would have this conversation about leading through adversity in this space, the Nelson Mandela Theater. Mandela was not only one of the great leaders of our lifetime, but he was certainly a leader who led his country through great adversity and change in challenging times. Speaking of challenging times, Mary Robinson reminded me that today is the second anniversary of the kidnapping of the girls in Nigeria. Mandela, among the many things he said about leadership, said, "It's better to lead from behind and put others in front, especially when you're celebrating victory. A leader must take the front line when there is danger or adversity. Then your leadership is appreciated." Well, I greatly appreciate the leadership of the women who have joined us this morning for this conversation. They come from the front lines of politics, business, and religion. They have agreed to share their personal stories about their choice to become a leader and their experiences of leading through adversity. And together with you, we're going to explore this whole concept of what makes a great leader in a political environment of headlines about corruption, concerns about authenticity, and ambition. It's worth noting, too, at this time that there are 22 countries in the world today being led by women presidents or prime ministers, most of them elected, some appointed. 22 is a long way from the total equality of representation that would be in much greater numbers, but nonetheless, these women represent the full political spectrum, from left to right, on all policies and positions. So seated here on this stage is a former president of Ireland, Mary Robinson. And a current candidate for president of Iceland, Halla Tomasdottir. Now, if numbers are a measurement, and they are, we are a long way from equal representation in either boardrooms or in parliaments. But there are places where progress has been noted by the numbers, and one of those places is Iceland, which has carved some new paths toward leadership for women and has become, as the World Economic Forum says, one of the best places, if not the best place in the world, to be a woman. So as I introduce each of the women who have joined us this morning, they're going to share a story about the times that they have led through adversity. And I'm beginning with Mary Robinson. Always a bit of a rabble-rouser, as she told us yesterday in her plenary speech, coming of age during the civil rights struggles in the U.S. She returned to Ireland to run for Parliament first, as one of the youngest women ever to do so, and became the first woman elected to the presidency of Ireland. There are many times of challenge and adversity during Mary's leadership. So Mary, would you start us off this morning by sharing one example of leading through adversity?
Okay, Pat. I think I'd like to talk about shortly after I came back from studying at Harvard, full of a kind of Harvard Law School arrogance. I was aware that the law in relation to family planning in Ireland was a mess because it was against the criminal law to either buy or sell a condom, but it wasn't against the law at all to use a condom. And if you wanted to use the contraceptive pill, your doctor had to prescribe that you had cycle regulation problems. And we used to joke in Ireland that an awful lot of women, it must be the weather, had cycle regulation problems. But, so full of a kind of, when I was elected to the Senate, I was elected on a platform, and top of my list was to reform the family planning law, which would be a simple measure of reforming an earlier Criminal Law Act of 1935. And what I was completely unprepared for was the fact that I overnight became a hate figure. I was denounced from pulpits, I was denounced in newspapers, I got hate mail, much of which my loyal husband Nick, or husband-to-be Nick as it was for part of that time, destroyed because I was very disturbed by it. And I remember walking down the main street in Dublin, Grafton Street, and actually feeling people were going to jump out and say, you're the devil incarnate, you know, I mean, literally. And then I realised that if you really believe in something and want to do it, you've got to pay a price, and you've got to be prepared to pay a price. And I never afterwards felt that it was so difficult to pay the price. Somehow doing it young and knowing you have to do it gives you great strength, I think. And it was a lesson that I kind of talk to students about it from time to time, and I say, really remember, be prepared to pay a price if you really believe in something.
What are the lessons of leading at all times, but certainly through adversity? Thank you, Mary. So Halla was a former business leader and investor in Iceland and lived through, as did the people of that country, the economic crisis of 2008, and has now made this courageous step into the political arena. Can you share with us one of the toughest decisions as a leader, either on the business side or in your current position, and what you took away from that decision?
Sure, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to go back 10 years. I was at the time the CEO of Iceland Chamber of Commerce, which is sort of the leading organization for businesses and the banks in Iceland at the time. And 20 days after I took over in that role, the first woman to be in that role, Iceland experienced some financial difficulties or economic difficulties, and this is in the year 2006. And so I found myself in this challenging context of having to do good in my role, but over a period of just a few months, discovering that very few of the things that were going on around me aligned with my values and my view and vision of the world. And it was extremely tough because as a woman, and particularly when you're the first woman, you have to do your job and you have to do your duty and you have to do it at least as good or better. Exactly, you have to do it better. But at the same time, the more I learned about the state of the financial sector internationally and at home, the less I slept and the less I believed in what was going on. And it was not in line with my own principles and values. And so a year or less than a year after taking on that role, I made the decision to resign, to found my own investment firm based on different values. And this was in the year 2007, the height of the bubble in Iceland. So we got laughed about because we founded it as a group of women. And a year after that, or a year and a half after that, actually Iceland had its infamous economic meltdown. And we survived intact. So I would say that the lessons I draw are very personal, and they are about you have to be your authentic self to be good at anything. You can't really be good if you're not your authentic self as a leader, and you have to stick to your principles, and you have to believe in your insights and the way you feel just as much as what you can rationalize or what seems good to everybody else. And if you follow that, all is good. And I think that was a very important lesson for me. Not an easy choice to leave a big, prominent post after only a year there. I got a lot of criticism for that. Also got a lot of laughter for sticking with my own principles, but they actually served me and a lot of our customers very well, because pretty much everybody else in the sector suffered enormous casualties.
So the lessons that you have now taken into a campaign for the presidency will be important for us to hear. Our next two women are extraordinary leaders and come to us from the front lines of religion, and both of them taking on huge challenges, both personally and through their work, to look at the misrepresentation of women, to look at the way in which women have opportunities to lead in religion as well. Alaa Murabit is one of 11 children, born in Canada, returned to Libya, our home country, in 2005, and founded, during the revolution there, the Voices of Libyan Women, and led a very challenging campaign to change the way in which women were being viewed in her faith. Alaa, can you talk to us about that time?
So I think probably the greatest challenge or the lesson learned for me during that time was we had a choice when we started our campaign, the Noor campaign, and Noor in Arabic means enlightenment. And so we went into it with very positive messaging. We were going to take the verses from the holy book, the Quran, and from the sayings of the Prophet, Hadith, and we were going to put those on billboards and in commercials. We were going to go to schools to do seminars. We were going to collect statistics through surveys. So we had a very, very clear plan for this campaign. And leading up to the campaign, my brother actually said to me, you know what, it would be a good idea to approach the religious authorities. And this proved to be an extremely contentious issue because there is a very, very vocal majority in women's rights that say you should never approach the religious authorities. You give them more power by them being part of the conversation. And for me, it was a no-brainer that they had to somehow be included, not only because of their credibility in society, which as a women's rights organization challenging misinterpretation of religion, we did not yet have, but also because of their access. With their authority, we could go into schools, we could get into the media, we could be able to do something that was much more widespread, cost-effective, and to people who we needed to be talking to. Because while we can all sit here and agree that the representation of women was wrong, we all already agree, and we needed to be able to access the people who were listening to those authorities. And so we went through about 6 months of constant conversation with them, and we went through negotiations, and we had to compromise. And ultimately, it became the largest campaign ever conducted in Libya, and listed by the UN as one of the most successful campaigns, and now replicated in 24 countries globally. And I think what it comes down to is both a mix of the two, of because I had done it young, I was 22, so it made everything else after seem much easier. But also because it aligned with our interests, and it aligned with my belief that if the conversations about women are happening at 10 p.m. in rooms where religious leaders can sit and women cannot, we have to be part of those conversations. And if we cannot access those platforms, we have to create our own. And for me, it was just practicality, I think.
And the success of that campaign is something that we want to come back to as well in our conversation. Reverend Canon Mpho Tutu van First, ordained bishop in the Episcopal Church.
Bishop.
Priest, sorry. Yes, it was the bishop who created some of the adversity, wasn't it? Yes. Ordained priest in the Episcopal Church. And recently made some personal choices that led to a time of great adversity, and has agreed to share that story with us.
So I got married in December, which was a good and joyful thing. I got married to a woman in December, which is a little more challenging for our communion than might otherwise be. As an Episcopal priest canonically resident in the Diocese of Washington, D.C., my bishop is perfectly fine, and our canon allows for same-sex marriage. And so I continue to be a priest in good standing in my diocese. However, I am licensed I was licensed in South Africa in the Diocese of Saldanha Bay. And the canon in South Africa at the moment, the canon on marriage, does not allow for same-sex marriage. And in fact, the bishop of the diocese in which I'm licensed was instructed that he must revoke my license to exercise my priestly ministry in that diocese. And I said to the bishop that rather than revoke my license, I would like to offer you my license. He told me that in the course of his conversations around the diocese, in that diocese of Saldanha Bay, the response by the clergy in the diocese had been really amazing to me, because the majority of the clergy said to him that if he was forced to revoke my license, he would have to revoke their licenses as well. And that's not just a vocational choice, but it's also an economic choice, because for most of these people, this is their livelihood. They're stipendiary priests, and this is their livelihood. And so in offering the bishop my license, got out of that piece of the bind was saying, I appreciate the statement and the sentiment and the support. However, there is a conversation that we need to have in our communion that we have been very willing, and particularly in the Anglican Church in South Africa, that we've been very willing to sort of slip under the carpet for years. And that conversation is around what is the nature of marriage? What does it mean to be in loving relationship? Why is it okay to marry a couple in which there is violence and abuse? Why is it okay to marry a couple when clearly there isn't a faithful relationship? And yet we are so challenged by the idea of a faithful and loving relationship and creative, generative relationship between two people because they happen to be of the same gender. And of course, being African, it has caused quite a stir, not only in my
Not just
my
African,
home country.
Tutu, come on.
Well, yeah, that too.
That caused a little response.
Yeah, that too.
But what we had hoped to launch in this sharing of stories of personal and professional adversity is that there are really no leaders who haven't faced times of adversity. But in starting here, start to unpack, as it were, all the complex notions around what makes a great leader, and then the even more complex and challenging subject of the differences between women leaders, who happen to be these 4 leaders on this stage, and the differences that courageous leaders and women leaders make around the world. And that's the conversation we are going to explore together and then with all of you. And Mandela also said a wonderful thing about courage and leadership, saying that I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man or woman is not he who conquers it and does not feel afraid, but is not the one who feels afraid, but he or she who conquers that fear. So in times of adversity, or even in the personal decision to step forward, to be a leader, to take a chance, where does that courage come from? Where did that original choice come from that said, I have that courage, I have that commitment, I'm going to step forward? Mary?
You're looking at me. I mean, I think my early interest in human rights and early experience was being wedged between 4 brothers, 2 older than me and 2 younger than me. So of course I had to be interested in human rights and equality issues. And I was fortunate enough at the time in Ireland to have 2 parents who completely believed in me and believed that I had the same opportunity as my brothers. And that was very unusual in the west of Ireland, and I think probably in a lot of societies. But it certainly, at that time, in the 50s and then going to college in the 60s, I mean, even going to college was a bit unusual for a woman. And I mean, your choice was either to get married or be a nun. And actually, in my final year in my convent school in Dublin, I decided it was better to be a nun. And I went to the Reverend Mother and offered myself. And to my surprise, she didn't say, well, that's wonderful, Mary. She said, yes, Mary, I think you should go away for a year. And then I went to Paris, so of course that changed everything. But,
I'm sure there's stories there we'd like to explore, Mary, but we won't.
Oh, no, we put a veil over that. No, but I'm trying to sort of think about courage. I think, yes, I saw wonderful courage as High Commissioner for Human Rights on the ground in the places where people were frontline defenders. And I so admired, and I actually felt so inspired and so energized. And I would come back from visits to the DRC, to Kosovo, to, you name the places, East Timor. And I would feel energized. And people would say, why are you so positive, almost optimistic? And I would say, no, I'm just fired up by what people can do in such difficult circumstances and stay there and do it and have the courage and resistance. And I think that's where we really see the courage and leadership. It's, those faces of those thousands of, many of them women, not all of them women, but frontline human rights defenders. I admire so much what they do and what they stand for.
And so many times there are stories about the courage to step forward and the commitment to stay forward does come from those early lessons that we learn at home. I'm looking at you, Alaa, because I know your family, 11 children. You no doubt felt Mary's same feeling of having your voice heard. But what was it about what you observed at home or learned from your parents that gave you the courage to step forward and choose to be a leader?
Well, I think, so as Mary had mentioned in her own upbringing, my parents were exceptionally supportive of the girls, equally so the boys. But I think the person who stands out to me most, and I love my dad, but is my mother. And the reason I say that is because in Arab culture, and actually in culture around the world, we're taught that you either have to be very hard if you're a leader, you have to be very tough. And we're taught that you have to raise people in a very harsh way. And my mother was very young when she got married, moved to a country where she didn't know the language, raised 11 children, and did it with, I think she did it with a courage that allowed for me to look at things in a different lens. So I don't believe in any way that I approached it with courage. I think that I was given opportunities where I went into medical school in the sciences because my parents were courageous enough to support me, and that because I had done that, I looked at it in a very practical, common sense lens, as a doctor would a patient. It may not be what you would want to do, but whatever is best for the patient is what you follow through on, which was the scenario for me in Libya. And I think I was able to have that opportunity and that mindset because my mother chose to be the exact opposite of what one would anticipate a mother of 11 kids would be. And she raised her daughters to be, pediatric plastic surgeons and psychologists and stay-at-home mothers, and to have that freedom of choice. So for me, I think courage comes from home. It comes from your upbringing, and it comes from knowing that in a world where where the environment definitely shapes us, you have to be able to have something at home which grounds you and allows you to believe in yourself to the point where you can go out and run for Senate or Parliament or President or run a business or change a religion. I mean, I think that starts with who raises us and what they teach us.
Reverend Canon Tutu, I think here you had a father who was one of the great leaders of our time in terms of human rights, freedom. What lessons did you take into your early choices to go into the church and to take up a leadership position there where there were clearly going to be challenges?
I always say that the vocation to ordain ministry may in some way have drawn pattern from my father. I think the style of ministry really draws from my mother. My mother has always had a very alive kitchen table ministry, and that was the ministry that was most visible to us as a family on a daily basis. I mean, everybody would come and have a cup of tea and tell them their woes or their joys or whatever it was that was the concern of the moment. But from both of my parents, I think what I drew was the courage to do the next right thing. And so the vision isn't, I have in mind a Nobel Prize down the road. It is rather, the person standing in front of me now needs this kind of care from me, and so this is what I am going to do. And I think that for all of us have that, the capacity for that piece of courage, that piece of, I can do the next right thing. Mm-hmm. I can't necessarily see the whole journey ahead of me, but I can see this choice that's right in front of me.
So much of the conversation currently about leadership is the lack of doing the right thing. We live in a political landscape now where the headlines about political corruption, the break between the trust of the governed and the people who are governing has raised additional concerns about what it takes to be a leader, and particularly a leader who leads from moral values. And Halla, you're in a campaign now for the presidency, and you are living at a time in Iceland where there is an unexpected disruption in a country with stories of corruption at the top. So how have you addressed that from the perspective of someone putting themselves forward to be the leader?
Well, maybe just to go a little bit back from that, I also want to appreciate the fact that I was raised by hardworking parents who gave me good principles and provided me opportunities. But I took a lot of inspiration from the women who came before me. So I feel incredibly lucky to be born in Iceland in spite of our difficulties from time to time. But when I was only 7 years old, women in Iceland did an incredible thing. On October 24th in 1975, which happened to be my mom's birthday, they took the day off, or they went on a strike, and they did no work, whether they worked at home or held professional positions. And they literally brought the country to its knees. Nothing worked in Iceland that day. I was 7. And you look at that, you look at doing power so differently, so collaboratively, and in such a shared way. And you are motivated to say, we can make a difference, and together we make a greater difference. And this was the beginning of a movement that's been very beneficial for me as a woman, being born in Iceland. And I think 5 years later, this made a big difference when we had the first woman to run for president in a democratic election, Ms. Mpho Tutu, and she was elected president. And she was a president for 16 years, and was a huge inspiration for anyone of my age. And when you have women like that and people like that that go before you, it is your duty to continue on their shoulders to do something for the next generations. And I think the reason I made this decision, the biggest reason, is I've seen before, when I founded my own company, that I didn't feel things were right, and I thought we could work from a different set of values and principles, and I did it and it served me well. Well, for a few years now, I've been feeling like we haven't learned enough from what happened in 2008, whether it be in Iceland or in the world. And I feel like, how can I just sit back and have a conversation around another dinner table about that and not ask, what can I do? How can I serve? And how could I possibly offer myself up to the next phase in change in the world for the better? Which is not about fixing Excel, because we fixed a lot of things in Excel in Iceland. So our economic growth is up, our unemployment is down, we fixed a lot of things there. But the social contract broke in 2008. And it became very apparent just last week that we haven't learned enough and fixed enough, and we're not working from the principles that the people of Iceland want to work from. So I'm so proud again to be Icelandic, because what happened in Iceland, the people of Iceland, now women and men of all ages, of all political backgrounds, came out and said, these are not the values we embrace in Iceland. These are not the principles we want to build our society and our social contract on. And I think the next phase in our change process is happening, and I'm offering myself up as a facilitator of that process. And whether I'm elected or not doesn't really matter, but to have the conversation about the values and the principles and the vision of something better is important.
And that conversation is resonating all over the world now. I referenced that along with this sort of broken trust, there are also these questions about what makes an authentic leader, and how do you judge authenticity in the light of the clear ambition that's necessary to put yourself forward, to run as a leader. Mary, how do you see what's happening across the world in terms of moral leadership and the need for it at this particular time, maybe more than ever?
Well, in a way, I'm fortunate to be a member of a group that Nelson Mandela brought together, the Elders. And we are always thinking about the most difficult crises in the world, and also issues like early child marriage, where we led a Girls Not Brides large coming together of so many people who had been trying to work in that, and we just gave it a lift because we had the moral authority collectively to do that. And I think we are very aware of the lack of a kind of leadership in the world politically. We're very in favour of a woman being the new Secretary General of the United Nations, because we feel that would have just a different prioritising. If you look at the way women organise, and it's really true at all levels. It's true in business, it's true at grassroots, it's true, every women's organisation. It's more collaborative, more problem solving, more listening, and it's just a different way of doing. And I think we need more of that kind of leadership. because we have very, very difficult problems that we're not getting on top of in the world. And I'm therefore very strongly in favour of women's leadership. I like quotas to get us there more quickly, and I think we need the critical mass of women. It's just men have dominated the leadership roles in so many different areas, not just in political leadership, but also business, etc. And so I love Halla's story and determination and commitment. And I also want, at a certain point, to come back to the essence of what we've been saying at the moment, which is the capacity of women in the home to change everything. And that's what we're going to need to make the transition to a sustainable world. I mean, that's actually what we're going to need.
I think that's actually a very important point, because when we speak about leadership, we tend to find ourselves talking about CEOs and presidents, and unfortunately, I think that we don't focus enough on the localized leadership, on what it takes to be able to propel a woman to being a president or a CEO is leadership in the home, leadership in the school, leadership in the community. And if we look at every country, I don't think Iceland would be the only one that comes to a halt if those women stopped working for a day. But the vast majority of your medical practitioners, your nurses, your teachers are women. And that is what is going to lead our next generation. That is where the social fabric is built. So I think leadership needs to be spoken about in all its forms, the highest leadership, but also at the very base, at the very grassroots, and in every community.
And there is an awful lot of conversation, again, about this, that with all the complex problems that we're facing as a world, that we do need an approach, a different kind of approach, and the call has been for women's leadership, and we're seeing it. And yet there are still people who say, well, let's look at the outcomes of women's leadership. And while it's been proven to produce better bottom lines, so economic data is in on more women in management and boardrooms and places of power and authority have made a positive difference, there is still debate about the differences that women make as leaders. Reverend Tutu, come into this conversation from your perspective, looking at your country where women's names are being put forward, as possible presidential candidates for in the country, and the whole look at women as leaders across the continent of Africa.
I think that that issue of critical mass really is an important one, because we lead as women, but we really need to have a critical mass of women who are willing to also subscribe to our style of leadership. I mean, it's fine to have a woman CEO, but when everybody sitting around the table in the boardroom is male, then essentially the way you manage to propel the organization forward is to be a man in a skirt.
Exactly.
And that, and that really doesn't change anything. And even in South Africa, looking at the political climate there, which is it's not only the tragedy of a country that seems to have really lost its moral compass, but also the voices in women's leadership in the ANC are. It's not the kind of women's leadership that we would want to. It's not what we would want to characterize as being women's leadership. And so it's also that we have to look across all of our metrics. So it's not just do you have the chromosome, but also do you have the attitude, and from where do you derive your power? Do you derive your power from your local population? Do you derive your power from your community? Do you derive your power from your party? Is it something that is handed to you by the men in positions of power and authority, in which case you're beholden to them for your power, and so you're always protecting and subscribing to their way of doing things, and then you're not in a position to change anything. And that, I think, is also, it's crucial for us to not only look at the gender matrix, but to say, okay, you know, where is your power? Is your power in being a woman? Because sometimes that's exactly the place of power. Or is your, you know, do you derive your power from some other place? So, for instance, you know, as a black woman, as a black person, I'm relatively powerless. You know, sort of relative to a white person, I'm powerless. However, as a clergy person, with most women, I'm relatively powerful. And you know, and then there's a difference there. And I think that I just wanted to just highlight, you know, sort of a way of exercising power, which was demonstrated last year when South Africa was having the fees must fall crisis, and the students were protesting on college campuses all over South Africa, and a beautiful example of exercising power, and exercising power as women, exercising power particularly as white women. White women students on South African campuses formed a cordon around their black colleagues. So the black students were inside the cordon of white women, because the white women knew that even though the police were very willing, the riot police were very willing to baton charge students, they were not willing to be seen beating up white women.
I know everyone wants to jump in on this conversation about power, and why don't we just do that? Mary,
I just wanted to switch the focus, Pat, to your country and what's happening now with Hillary Clinton. And
I thought that might come up. That's right.
You know, the fact that so many young millennials, young women, resent being, you know, sort of somehow pushed into, she's a woman, for goodness sake, support her. And I wanted to ask Halla,
yes.
You know, you were talking about Vigdis, who was a great friend of mine.
Yes.
I love Vigdis, and the women that came before you. What do the millennials, what do the younger women in Iceland feel? Have they got a different reference point? Because I think that's really important.
Yeah, we've had some really interesting things happening on behalf of young women in Iceland. So we have sort of the next phase of the feminist movement, and it's very different from the one in the 70s. And so we recently had something called Free the Nipple, which is basically young women in Iceland said, you know, enough is enough. This is to feed children, you know, this is, you know, part of my biology. And they literally, we had young parliamentarians and everybody attend our public swimming halls and even our parliament building, you know, freeing the nipple. And, you know, I'm going to be very honest here. There were some of us at my age, and I don't consider myself all that old, and I'm pretty progressive, I think, that I wasn't sure about this. I have a 12-year-old daughter. You know, she doesn't have anything to free yet, but I'm not sure I wanted her to free anything. So this was a challenging thing for us. So we actually had lots of meetings that day that this became like a social media campaign and talked, and a lot of people reacted. You know, people thought, you know, this is not a good way to go. But then I thought, you know what, the young women are actually redefining what it means to claim power, and they were claiming power over their body in a very effective way, and creatively objectifying to all the sexualization that is done with women's body, and it made an impact. So I'm so proud of our young women and the women that are coming after me, and I actually look, and I think they are redefining power, and not just young women, but men. And because when we founded our investment firm, we said we wanted to put feminine values into finance. And so the idea was not that masculine values are wrong. The idea was that sameness and herd behavior is wrong, and we need better balance. And so I think what's happening with the young people, the millennial generations, their values are becoming more mixed of feminine and masculine values. They are actually in better balance between work and life, between the gender issues that we have. And I'm not sure we have all realized that. And so I have great hope. And when I'm here this week, I mean, all of these people that equality is a non-issue to, it's just taken for granted. That's where I want us to get. And in order to do that, we need more women around the key decision-making tables. We can't have men gathering at 10 at night, all the same people making big decisions anymore. And I believe in gender quotas for that. I fought for that in Iceland. We got there for the boardroom just a few years ago. And it's not just women that are happy about it. Men overwhelmingly are. It changed the boardroom dialogue. It changed the way we look at business. We have a bigger definition of success as a consequence of it. We have a long way to go, but our corporate governance is better. Our businesses are better when we have the balance.
I want to come back to quotas and other paths to greater equality, but we have a millennial sitting among us, and so we need to hear your thoughts on this intergenerational concept about leadership.
I think it accentuates actually the intergenerational conflict that exists within the women's movement, because in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, women's rights was not as common as it is now, and in order to fight for it, you did have to adapt, and I completely respect and appreciate that, because activists like me would not be able to do the work we are doing had it not been for an earlier generation which worked within a power structure that existed and had to mold themselves to that power structure. So I respect that. However, we've come to a point now where unfortunately my generation has seen a lot of women leaders turn into, yes, men with skirts. They become part of the system. They adopt the system. And if anything, they play the game better than anybody else, because that's the only way they could get to where they are. And from my own personal perspective, and I think one that many women my age and men my age share, is it is inevitable that we're going to have women's leadership. I mean, I don't doubt for a second that we're going to have women's leadership, be it in America or anywhere else in the world. There are inevitabilities. So you're going to have a woman president, but it has to be the right one. So it's not, gender cannot be the only point, but we have so many different identities now. I'm a woman, I'm a Muslim, I'm young. I mean, all those different identities come into play. And when I look at a leader, you can't just be a woman, but you have to be a woman who respects and identifies all of my beliefs and all of my identities and says, okay, so I see you as a young person. This is what I can offer you in terms of education and healthcare. I see you as a mother. This is what I can offer you in terms of childcare, etc. So to me, it becomes much more rounded, and it can't simply be because of her gender. She has to be a person who I would vote for if she were a man, is the way I define it. So if you have those kind of values, then...
So it's about the values more than...
It's about the values. And I think we also have we have this imbalance where we say, well, masculine leadership and feminine leadership. And I think even we as women are unfair. Because when a woman is tough, everybody's like, oh, she's being such a man. And that's not what I mean by being I think women need to be tough. I think any leader needs to be tough. Any leader needs to be compassionate. Any leader needs... But when men do it, it's this phenomenal quality. It's, so-and-so cried at a speech about the soldiers passing away. What a great guy. And if a woman does it, she's emotional. So I think we as women also need to be fair. We need to be able to judge both by that same metric of, if you are compassionate, okay. If you are honest, okay, and take it from there. But I think gender alone is no longer a deciding factor for me.
That seems like a good place to open up the conversation. So we have microphones on each side of the aisles, and even though we can't really see you as you raise your hand because of the lights in our eyes, these young women and men who have the microphones can. So if you raise your hand, they'll come to you. And as we said before, please wait until there is a mic in your hand and identify yourself before you question. And so that we can incorporate as many as possible, make your question as short as possible too, please.
Hi, I'm Mara Bolas from Oxfam. Thank you so much for this panel. This is like a dream come true panel and moment, really. So we're at a conference around social enterprise, and at Oxfam I do work with women's entrepreneurship and identifying barriers to women achieving their full economic potential. My contention now for some time, observing the women entrepreneurs that we've worked with in the pilot in Guatemala, is that I believe that women are natural social entrepreneurs. And what I see is a lot of women who are building normal growth businesses versus hyper growth businesses, and then spending time, spending scarce resources investing in their families and communities, which we know the 90% reinvestment of disposable income, right? But I see that playing out within a business context. So for example, there's a woman that we're supporting that's built a medium enterprise that's very successful. She, on the side, with other female colleagues, set up a community daycare center where she takes time out of her work to volunteer once a month, right? That is time that she could have been using in profit-maximizing activities, but that is not what she's doing. She's using that time to give back to her community. To me, that's social entrepreneurship, in a way. Anyway,
so is there a question?
That's my question. Is, do you see women in leadership skills? What I'd like to see is sort of the same hyper focus and glorification around social enterprise, around women in business and enterprise for the social good potential.
Great. And thank you for your work and that story. Mary, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, we allow business to do business under a kind of contract. And it's not just the bottom line. It's not just profit. And I think, we need different models. And of course, Muhammad Yunus has given us the model of you can have business for profit, but you can also have business to solve problems. And I think he's absolutely right. And we need more flexibility about this and more opportunities. This is your world.
I mean, yeah, thank you for the question. I think you're pointing at something that I at least intuitively feel very strongly about, and that is that there is a relationship, and a strong one, between gender or female leadership and what I call a triple bottom line approach to business. And I'm a big proponent of profit, people, planet being the norm that should be introduced at all levels of business, but I think it starts with the social entrepreneurs. And I have not just found this from experience, but research shows that women have typically, and I say typically because a lot of great men share that, a bigger definition of success. So success isn't just about the financial profit or about the high growth. It is about having given back. And so I think these issues are very related, and I'm really sorry to know that only 3% of venture capital goes to female-founded companies, 97% to male-founded. I'm really sorry to say that less than 3% of capital in the world, which is actually our capital, our pension funds, is managed by women, because research shows that you invest in those who look like you. So I think we're missing out on changing the world by having more women manage money, investing more money into women, because I think almost by default you're going to get more responsible businesses and greater success on your area.
Thanks very much, Halla.
Pat,
Yes.
I do want to sort of bring in that the issue of visibility. So you know that woman volunteers at the daycare center because that information came to you somehow. But I think that if you canvass most workplaces, you'll find that there's an extent of either of volunteerism or of altruistic giving that doesn't make it into the company's annual report. And that is done both by men and by women. It is done in ways that are formal and informal. It is, the number of people who I know in South Africa who are, sort of very casually, yes, I'm supporting my cousin's youngest daughter through college. But that's not it never makes it into the things that we measure and report. And so that invisibility, I think, it means that there's a huge piece of the story that's actually missing.
It's a very important point. And how do we value that in ways that are measured and that matter? Another question.
May I go ahead?
Yes.
Susan Collin Marks from Search for Common Ground, and thank you all so much. I'm absolutely riveted by all five of you. There was a book that came out a few years ago called Now It's Our Turn to Eat. It was about the development world. It was saying when our group or faction or party gets into power, we take everything. And I think this is something that we see throughout the world, and it's deeply troubling. And another way of looking at leadership, and one that I long for in the world, is to have political leaders, leaders at all levels, who are leaders for the whole, who come into power and who become leaders, and so for the whole of that society. I'm talking more at the political level, but this is the same at every level. And that in that sense, the leader is a healer. The leader is almost a facilitator of the differences that people have. The leader is modeling all the things you've been talking about. You've been bringing out the aspects of leadership so very beautifully. When this comes up, though, in the context of political leadership, there's often a block that's expressed, and this is where my question is, to ask for your thoughts and comments on this, which is what we need. We must have people who are in opposition. We must have that strong opposition. And yes, we need opposition. We need the different views. But that's often translated into this leadership for my group, my faction, my party, my tribe, my whatever it may be. And I just wondered if you could talk about this. In my work with political leaders around the world, which I've been doing for many, many years, this to me has crystallized as one of the most important ways that we really could have a breakthrough in our world and in our leadership, as we watch how leaders are often the ones taking their countries and their people into war, taking them into the conflicts that destroy everything.
Very complex question. So we start to, and a very good one. Thank you, Susan. Both of you have experiences, well, all four of you do, from the various front lines. Mary, do you want to start?
You know, I know exactly what you're talking about, and it is very troubling. We do need opposition to check government. I mean, I think it's better if we can have the valuing of that capacity to check power, basically. But I'm just so aware that we need political leaders now with not just a holistic but a long-term vision, you know, and we need leaders who will fulfill the Agenda 2030 and actually make it real that we seek the furthest behind first, that we prioritize. I mean, the Industrial Revolution has led to a kind of gross inequality in our world, aggravated by the lack of checks now on capital flows, etc. And so it is extraordinary. I mean, Oxfam have written about the 62 richest people in the world have more than half the rest of the world. I mean, it's gross. So we need a leadership that is actually going to take the agenda that the world has now and take it seriously and take it to 1.5. And women are going to have a massive role to play in changing behaviour, because we can't have business as usual. We have to change behaviour.
Well, I was just going to add to that. I think we also, in my view, have to be very realistic in recognizing that political leaders are no longer the be-all and the end-all. The political arena has taken itself out of much of the governing space and allowed for non-state actors, and be it corporations or insurgency groups. It's funded them, it's supported them. So I think political leadership was needed 20, 30 years ago before they made those decisions, because the arena has been opened. And now we have to talk both about political leadership in terms of governance, but we also have to talk about corporate leadership and their responsibilities, because about the hierarchies that about the institutions, let's say, that we've created, be it media or whatever it is, that helps govern societies now. So I think that we also have to be very realistic in recognizing that there is no political leader who is going to answer to all of our questions, and that really their job needs to be creating a space where the government can govern and where the external actors can function in their own space. And that is going to be, in my view, extremely, extremely difficult.
Just a real quick, the crisis of our times is actually lack of leadership, whether it be in business or in government, but we are seeing more of it and different forms of it. I think in general, the bifurcation that you're mentioning is a problem. I mean, in the business world, we have a lot of people out there saying we're going to make money any way we can, and then we become filthy rich, and then we become philanthropists and give away money, and we choose who actually deserves to do that. I'm completely, that model is challenging to me, because I would like to see us do more good business, to bring those sides together. And the same thing in government. I would like to see leaders who say, I'm here, I might be part of a political party. I'm not running for president as part of that. It's one of the reasons I'm going for that role is because you can think long term. I think we need leaders who are willing to step beyond the immediate structure they belong to and think of the whole.
But I think we have leadership. So
that's leadership.
I think we have leadership. I mean, if we look at what's been created in the past 15 years by people under the age of 30, we have leaders. We just do not give them the space in our government. We have, I mean, the largest communication devices in the world now, the things that have changed the structure of the world, were created by 23 and 19-year-olds. So I think we have to be realistic. The Google Science Prizes are going to 18 and 19-year-olds. There are leaders out there. We just have to cultivate a sense in them that they belong to a greater cause, and that they can also be political or economic leaders. And what we've done is we've created this belief that political and economic leaders are unfortunately older, usually older men, but older, and that you cannot enter that arena. So
they're John, David, or Peter.
Exactly. So I think I think we have to be a bit more honest about the space that we create for young leadership, because it exists.
There's so much question.
Yes, over here. All right.
I'm supposed to be next, but I'm not sure. Megan Morris-Carter, I'm the director of the University of Oxford's Entrepreneurship Centre, based here at the Business School. And I'm seeking some practical advice from the panel, because we spend a lot of time with young entrepreneurs, students who want to set up not-for-profit or for-profit businesses, but also trying to inspire future leaders who come out of Oxford to be entrepreneurial, to use their entrepreneurial talent in different ways, in the political arena or in charities or whatever. And in general, I agree with Alaa that I tend to treat men and women equally in terms of when we accept students onto the programme, we tend to treat them in very much the same way and trying to make everything applicable to both genders. But I feel sometimes that we don't inspire and engage the female leadership in the university as well as we could do. And I'm interested in the panel's views as to how one does that without being patronising or without sort of singling out women, but whilst giving them the opportunity.
Great question. And just to be sure that we get in more questions, and we have less than 10 minutes left in the session. So, Alaa, will you take that? Because it feels that that's exactly what you were talking about earlier.
I think what it comes down to when you're talking about inspiring female leadership or inspiring their passion is creating the space in which it's reciprocated. Right? So I find personally that a lot of times, and it's good that you mentioned young men, because we can't have a conversation about women's leadership without talking about masculinity and how that plays a role in it. But I think it's very important for you to be able to go up to those young women, and when they do come up with something, when there is an idea, they get the same treatment, the same reciprocation that a young man would. And that doesn't come individually from you. That comes from Oxford. That comes from the institution, because it's an institutionalized preference that we give to young men or to men in general. And that exists in institutions like this, and one person might not change that, but it can definitely start. So I think it becomes about the reciprocation, and if somebody has an idea, if somebody has a suggestion, then they're treated in the same respect as anybody else. That would be my recommendation.
Let's take another question. Thank you. Yes.
Gillian Caldwell with Global Witness. My question is about the role that you've experienced of emotional intelligence, emotional and psychological intelligence in leading through adversity. The conversation we had earlier sort of about a form of essentialism, this nature-nurture debate, and who are women, and are they acculturated in particular ways, or do they have biological predispositions, is one we could probably, argue till the cows come home. But until I was a parent, I didn't really fully comprehend the role that nature can play, having a girl and a boy, in helping shape who and how they are in the world. And I do feel in my own experience that if I look at opportunities for my leadership through adversity, they've almost all been enabled by my capacity for emotional and psychological intelligence. So I wonder if that's an experience that any of you have had, and if you could reflect more specifically on a situation in which that was called upon of you to lead through adversity.
Thank you. Who'd like to take that? Mary, you want?
Well, it does remind me very much of the difficulty serving as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, because I had to go to the most difficult places and I had nothing to offer those there. I couldn't, force a government to stop torturing. I couldn't, except to kind of empathize and listen. And I learned about the power of listening. There were many fractured, desperate people and listening to them helps them. You know, I could see it. And bring back their stories and help them to get their stories out, yes, and to get there and to be heard. But it definitely was pure emotional linking and intelligence and listening and compassion and just understanding without being able to do anything, which was kind of frustrating for me. But for them, it was often enough that at least you listened.
Mpho,
I wanted to jump in because I was struck by the giving space as opposed to claiming space. So, you know, claiming that space for exercising your leadership. And I think, you know, we may not be able to give space, we may not even quite know how to give space, but we can validate.
Yes.
And that's, you know, and I think that the experience that young men have very often is of being validated, of having their ideas validated, whether we think whether or not we like the idea, it's a valid idea. I disagree with you, but it's a valid idea. And that the experience that women and girls often have is that their idea is kind of pushed off the table without even being considered. And so I think, you know, in all of the fora in which we find ourselves, the gift of validation, the gift of listening, is one that can help enhance all of those leadership opportunities.
Just to both of your questions, I'm a mother of a boy and a girl, and there is a female entrepreneur in Iceland who's done an incredible work that I think touches on both of your questions here previously. She basically does supplemental education for boys in kindness and compassion and friendship and all of the things that she feels that maybe, whether it's biology or sociology, doesn't really matter, but they need more help with, and for girls in confidence and courage. And so she does extra hours, she separates the genders and does extra hours on the things in order to create balanced individuals. I think this is, and she's been very successful, and my kids went to her early education schools, and I have a very compassionate son. He's quite different. He's 14, but he's quite different from his same age boys who did not have that. And my girl, I have to constantly work on bridging the confidence gap, because for some reason our teenage girls are particularly troubled, and we need to work on the confidence gap. It's not a capability issue, but it is a confidence issue.
But it's not for some reason. And I agree with you, it's wonderful that one teacher is taking that on, but this shouldn't be a teacher by teacher basis. This should be something that we change globally. We need to start redefining what it means to be a young girl and a woman, and what it means to be a young man. We have to stop telling boys that they have to be rough and hard and always in control, and young women that they have to be, like, it's not a one-place situation.
She's created an entire school system to do that, which I think is, but we should do it everywhere.
Everywhere.
I agree.
And I think it's the responsibility not only of women's rights activists, but of women leaders who get to be in that position, because oftentimes when a woman leader gets to be in that position, she starts forgetting she's a woman, and she starts focusing on removing herself from that. And I think they need to be able to take the lead on this and say, let's start redefining what it means to be a young woman.
Yeah, but I think also that we cheat men, or men get cheated in that kind of binary, you know,
Exactly.
the woman nurture, I mean, because when you see men who are free to nurture, that, you know, that becomes a real joy and a full, you know, that there's a fullness of life for them as well. So I think we're cheating ourselves
And we excuse it when we say that men are by nature this way and women are by nature this way. We excuse bad behavior, and that's not acceptable. We need to start saying we have been taught to be this way.
I don't think we're going to actually answer that question conclusively this morning, but it does lead us to this ultimate question, which again I recognize is hardly the simple one. But I'm struck by the generational concept here about what kind of leaders we're looking for in this perspective, Alaa, that you put forward, that it's not about gender. And yet, is there, so we'll just take the question, is there a difference between women and men leaders, and in particular in the way we lead through adverse times, which is clearly the way we describe the time we're living in now. So we'd like to take that on first.
Now, yes. I'll take that on. I think we have to unpack that a little bit, because leadership at a certain level, I agree with you. Women at a certain level are forced to compromise. So they'll work together more closely. They'll align their interests. They'll try to get critical support. I agree with that. I think by the time a woman reaches a particular position in many parts of the world, usually she's had to forfeit that, because there can only be, unfortunately in our society, one woman at the top. And in order to play that game, the leadership changes almost into a very, what we would define as male kind of type of leadership. So I think, yes, on a grassroots level, I think in a community level, women are forced by nature of having their voices heard to amplify their voices. And I think by the time they get to the top, that changes.
Well, no, I think that now we build on what has gone before, and so women lead very differently from the ways that men lead. Maybe in the future this is going to look different.
Yeah, I don't agree either, because instinctively, in the climate sphere, we have a group of women leaders on climate change, and they are from, they're ministers and heads of agencies who happen to be women, and we also have some supportive men as part of this, but we keep men in their place. I mean, it's and it is it's a real engagement of these women. We meet regularly on climate issues as women ministers, I think, and we're now linking with grassroots women as a mark of how we'll do it differently. And so I don't agree that you necessarily hive off when you get to a top level. I think there's a real interest in doing it differently.
Between social and political.
Yeah.
There's a difference, in my opinion, in the social and political. So climate change, as I agree with you, is a space, even social entrepreneurship, even women's rights, human rights. I do think women can take on the leadership role in that permanently. But in the political and business, I do tend to think that they have to emulate a little bit their counterparts.
Alaa.
I think it's important to distinguish between sex and gender. And I think sometimes we get into trouble when we talk women versus men, rather than feminine values versus masculine values. And I do think we need to talk about that. Yeah. There are masculine women, there are feminine men. It's about the values. And I think we need to talk about gender because it's a conversation about values. Yeah. And women, and it matters, and it's a question about, are we going to be stuck in the past set of values that govern business or politics or something else, or are we going to go to the future where androgyny or balance in gendered ideas is the best form of leadership? Yeah. That's where I want to go.
With great apologies to all the hands that were raised, and with great appreciation for the women who have joined us this morning, who through their values and actions and choices certainly define leadership. Thank you very much.